Today we're gonna run our application in the Docker and Docker Compose. First of all, you need to install the Docker and Docker Compose itself, and then let's try to begin from the simple idea just to run one application in the Docker. Then we will try to run only one application in Docker Compose, and then we will complicate our task and try to run all the three applications in the Docker Compose, and then we just gonna run PostgreSQL database along with our microservices applications. I propose to start with Eureka server because it doesn't have dependencies for database. It doesn't have dependencies from the other applications. Okay, let's try to create simple Docker file to run our Eureka server in the Docker. First of all, need to create new Docker file. In this video, I'm not gonna explain what is Docker, what is Docker Compose, all that stuff you can read on the internet. There are a lot of tutorials and documentation for that. In this video, I'm just want to show you the example how to use this in practice. So Docker file is just a file with commands for Docker how to build the container. So we're gonna say we need a Java application, we need a JDK. I'm gonna paste from. I'm gonna use latest 11 Java version as we used previously for our microservices application. I'm gonna adopt OpenJDK, and I'm gonna use OpenJDK 11 and latest. For those of you who doesn't know all this stuff, I strictly suggest you to read about it a little bit. And just to, I wanna just short clarify this. It just goes to the Docker Hub and downloads OpenJDK latest version, and then we wanna get our jar file of Eureka server and run it. From the beginning of Java studying, you know that Java application can be simply run by command java -jar and the file to our application. For example, it's Eureka server 001 snapshot.jar. So this command we're gonna use to run our application in the Docker container. But firstly, we need to get this file and put it to our container. I'm gonna say args. I'm gonna create new variable jar, for example, jar file, and I'm gonna say that give me any file with the jar extension in the target directory. And Docker will try to navigate to the target directory and get the file with jar extension and put the link to that file to the jar file argument. And then I'm gonna let's say copy my jar file to the let's say up.jar and entry point java -jar up to jar. Actually, that's it. This Docker file gonna download OpenGTK 11 version, get our file from the target, copy it to the container, and then run the command java -jar app jar. Okay, let's try to navigate to the Eureka server. Open the terminal in the Eureka server. Sorry. And call docker build. Actually, if you use IntelliJ IDEA, you can use this green button to build your Docker container. But I want to show you the command itself. So we built our container, and we can check if it's built. We have a lot of containers. Let's see, 21 seconds ago. This is our container. I haven't specified a tag and repository for that. This is containers I prepared previously when I was preparing this tutorial. And let's try to run our application and see, to run our image and see how it will work. Actually, I expect that it will start the Eureka server. We need to use command docker run. We need to expose the port. Just a quick reminder, the port for Eureka server is specified as 8761, and I'm not gonna change it. And we gonna put the image ID. As you can see, guys, Eureka server started successfully. Let's navigate to the browser to check it. Localhost 8761, and we have our Eureka server started. And we can actually navigate to the container itself to check to check where our file, jar file, is located and other stuff. Let's just call docker ps. Here we see our Eureka container, and we can use name of the container and execute the bin bash. And we are inside the Docker container. If we do ls, we can see our app jar file. Actually, it's not really good to store this app jar file in the root of container. Let's just place it to the opt directory. And let's create some, for example, folder in the opt directory for that jar file. Let me exit from the container. Let me stop the container itself, and let's just change a little bit our file to store our jar file in the specific folder. For that, we need to create a folder before we gonna copy our jar file. For this purpose, we can use run command and mk directory command from the Ubuntu system, and let's call it Eureka server, and we're gonna copy our file to opt Eureka server. and that's much better. Now let's try to run our Docker. This time it started also successfully. Let's try to navigate to the container this time. As you can see now, we don't have the app jar in the root of our container. Now let's navigate to opt. Let's see. As you can see, we have Eureka server. Now let's navigate to the Eureka server, and we can see the app jar file, and that's much better. Okay, first step we did successfully. We started our application in the Docker file. Actually, it was pretty easy if you know Docker well, or if you read the documentation previously. And let me stop the container. And next step is to run this Docker file in the Docker Compose. And this time we're gonna create Docker Compose in the root of the Microservices app example directory. And firstly, we need to know the syntaxes of Docker Compose. Lucky for me, I know it, so we need to specify the version. Version gonna be 3.8, and the services. First service, and let's just try to run only one service, is Eureka server. We're gonna call it Eureka server, and we're gonna specify container name. Let's say Eureka, and we're gonna specify the build for that Eureka. I'm gonna paste Docker file to the Docker Compose. So I'm gonna specify build and context, and let me leave it as empty now. And Docker file is also empty because I wanna explain you something. So the tricky moment with that Docker Compose and Docker file is that they are located on different levels of the folders. Docker file is located in Eureka server, and Docker Compose YAML is located in the Microservices app example. So to avoid exceptions, we need to specify to be very attentive to the context of the build. And we need to say that context is gonna be Eureka server, and when we said that context is gonna be Eureka server, it will execute our Docker file inside this Eureka server context. So, and as of now, we just need to specify the Docker file. And that's actually all I wanted to explain about that build and context and Docker file. And let's expose the ports. Let me recall it. Yeah. And I think that's enough to build our Docker Compose and build our Eureka server through the Docker Compose. So when we start our Docker Compose, it's gonna navigate to the Docker file and execute commands from the Docker file. And we already saw what's gonna happen when the commands are executed by the Docker file. Let me navigate to the terminal, and let me make clear everything and make Docker Compose build. I'm gonna use no cache command because previously when I prepared this video I used a lot of build commands, so I don't want to mess it up in this Docker Compose. Let me build the Docker Compose. As you can see, it executes the same commands as it was executed when we built Docker. And let's start the application using Docker Compose up. Again, we could use, for example, these buttons to avoid using commands from the terminal, but I prefer terminal to show you the for those of you who doesn't have these buttons. Okay, Eureka server started successfully. We checked, it works as we expect. Let's just do the same job for the customer app and notification app. Let me just speed up a little bit the process. I'm gonna copy paste Docker file to the customer app and notification app. And let me close all the tabs. In the customer app, let's just change the file folder, because it's not important for our purpose, but I want to show you that it's really useful to have all naming conventions clear and other stuff. Notification app. And I guess that's it with Docker files for our applications. Now we're gonna navigate to the Docker Compose and build services for the customer app and notification app. I'm not remember the ports for the notification app. 8088. And actually notification app tries to register itself in the Eureka. So it depends on Eureka. It's better to start Eureka server before we start notification app and customer app. So I'm gonna add depends on command to tell the Docker Compose to start the notification app after the Eureka server. It's sometimes it doesn't help because you just need to it depends on just shows Docker Compose that you should build first Eureka server and after notification app, but build doesn't mean startup, and sometimes application which depends on other application starts before the dependent application, and that can lead to the problems, and then you need somehow to resolve this dependency programmatically or using some scripts for that. Let me add depends on and depends on Eureka server. Let me create this same file, this same service for the customer app. and change the port. As far as I remember, previously we set it as default, and by default it's 8080. Yeah, it's 8080. Okay, now it looks fine, but one thing we need to know about the containers is that they are running in their own IP addresses. It's not even it's not localhost anymore as we use in the localhost on the local machine. Yeah, the containers run on the local machine, but they don't use a localhost for their addresses. They all have their own IP addresses. And when notification app and the customer app will try to connect Eureka server, by default we haven't specified that, but by default Eureka server host is localhost 8761 Eureka, and we're gonna change this URL to the service name URL. And you can do it by adding the property to the application properties, something like Eureka client service URL default. If you navigate to this property, it's just a map, and default zone is default URL, as I told you previously, localhost 8761 Eureka, and that doesn't for our purposes right now it won't work because Eureka is not on localhost anymore. So we're gonna change this default URL for this default zone. So we're gonna add something like Eureka server 8761 Eureka, something like that. We can do it using application properties, and we can also do it by specifying this property as environment variable in the Docker Compose, and then Docker Compose will inject this environment variable in the application properties, and it also will work. So I prefer using Docker Compose because don't want to touch the application properties files for that purposes. So let's just navigate to the notification app and add environment variable to this service. Let me just add environment and something like that. Eureka client service URL default zone. Eureka server is the name we specified for our service. It should be actually the same, and we need to specify the same stuff for the customer app, and we also need to specify correct URL for the Eureka. Okay, I guess it should work. Let me stop the previous Docker Compose and make the build new Docker Compose. We are not using cache, and it takes some time to build the images. And let's try to start the Docker Compose. As you can see, it firstly recreates Eureka and then tries to create notification app and customer app. And as you can see, our application registered itself in Eureka. In the logs, you can see which application produces the log message. And let's navigate to the browser. In the instances, we're gonna see our applications. And let's check if our application works as it worked previously without Docker Compose. We're gonna navigate to localhost 8080. As you remember, guys, or if you don't remember, just watch the previous video when we created all that stuff with order. We prepared one customer by default with ID. Let's try to create an order for that customer. And as you can see, everything works perfect as it was working previously in the previous tutorial. And you can see the logs coming out from the services, and all the other stuff works perfect. And just with one, okay, not one, but 4 files, Docker Compose, and 3 files, Docker file. Let's just stop our service. One thing I promised you in the on the start of this video is that we're going to change the database to the PostgreSQL, because usually most people don't use in-memory database. So when I prepared this tutorial, I prepared some quick changes to migrate from the in-memory database to the PostgreSQL. Only customer app using database, so we're gonna navigate to the POM XML, find the in-memory database dependency and replace it with Postgres. And let's update Maven. Then we need to navigate to the property file and change the data source and other stuff. It's Hibernate dialect and Hibernate DDL auto update to create the tables if they are not created. And this is data source for our database, Postgres database. As you can see, I left DB URL, DB user, and DB password to paste these variables from the Docker Compose to the application properties. And why I haven't specified DB URL as localhost, because as in the previous example with Eureka, our database is not on localhost anymore. It has its own URL. It has its own IP address. And yeah, I created named my database customer app DB. Port I left by default, but yeah, we can actually specify the port itself. Let's navigate to the Docker Compose and try to firstly initialize the database and then initialize the customer application with that database. First of all, we need an image for the Postgres. This service name, you can use anyone. It's just a naming for your service, which we will use as we use it as Eureka server here. So we're gonna say that we're gonna get the image from the Docker Hub. I prefer Postgres, let's say version 9.4, because I tested and it works perfect on it. And actually, that's it for the Postgres. Let's specify username, password, and database. Let's specify environment. Let's add app user. You can ask, where did I get all this stuff for the Postgres? It's just on the Docker official documentation. If you, for example, print Postgres Docker Compose, you will be the first results on the Google will be something like Docker Comp or Docs Docker Comp or other stuff. So I navigated to this first URL and I found all the documentation for that Docker for Docker Compose. Here is environment variables that tell us Postgres password and description what these environment variables actually do. So let me continue with the setting up my Postgres. Postgres password is customer something like. In this video we're not gonna use secrets, but in the new version of Docker Compose secrets are present, and maybe I will record another video for the secrets to avoid revealing secrets in the Docker Compose, because it's not really secure to paste the password and user for the database and other secret stuff. And Postgres I'm not really remember how I called it. Okay, looks fine. And when we need to expose the ports, perfect. I don't think we need those. Okay, looks really good. Let's try to inject these variables to the these values to the customer application. Oh, sorry. DB URL Postgres, DB user app user, and DB password is customer app password. And we also need to say that this application depends on Postgres. Looks really good. And first of all, we need to make Maven clean install to regenerate the customer app jar file. It's really important to do that because the changes are not going to apply. Let me make Maven clean install. Okay, and then let's try to run. Firstly, let's build the containers. Okay, I guess we made some mistake and it doesn't want to connect to the Postgres. Let's check the logs. App user. Let me open the documentation because I think I just made a mistake in the naming. That's why I suggest you guys to copy paste instead of print. Okay, now db user, db URL, db password seems okay. Let's try once again. Let's make docker compose down. Let's make docker compose build no cache. And finally, docker compose up. Yeah, this time everything works perfect. Let's navigate to our application and try to execute one request. Internal server error. Let's try once again. I guess a notification app. Yeah, this time it works. It required some time to register notification app in the Eureka. And as you can see, everything works as it was working previously. But this time we used PostgreSDB, we used Docker Compose, we used Docker to run our microservices application. That's it for today, guys. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Goodbye.